Myself, Jane and Martin, we're going to speak about the work that we did within the food project in the CSIRO cluster. And the image on the front is actually taken from one of the pieces of art that was done as part of the food project, talking about you may not be able to read it up at the top, it's entitled, so it's by Joe Donnelly, Populate and Perish, 2010, and it's the contested landscapes of Western Sydney, so looking at how land use has been used in parts, and the idea, of course, from our perspective, what that means, urban sprawl vis-a-vis agricultural lands. So why are we interested in food and this relationship between cities, climate change and health? Well, there's a bi-directional relationship between the food system and climate change. The food system contributes to climate change in terms of greenhouse gases, biodiversity use, various waste outputs, so it contributes to that climate degradation, but of course climate change affects the food system itself and the ability of the food system to produce foods, so in terms of agricultural yields and also to do with price and a number of other factors that we'll pick up on. And within the food system, so what do I mean by that? So that's all the way from issues to do with agricultural production or food production up in the top left, through processing, manufacturing, the retail environment, the fast food, the food sector, service sector, and then of course what ends up on the plate and what we put into our mouths. And I'm just going to take it as a given that we know that there are very, very strong relationships between what we put in our mouth and how that contributes to health outcomes, particularly to do with non-communicable diseases. So just an overview of how climate change, so thinking about how do we adapt, climate change already impacting on agricultural yields across the world. Very broad brush analysis done by Klein and colleagues, and these are from 2007, these data, but you can see there are winners and there are losers. It depends where you live in the world or which country you're in. And of course within Australia we have great variability in terms of climate impact on agricultural yield, and we could certainly take that down to much finer grain, and I know colleagues within CSIRO and around the country have done that in a much more sophisticated way. But that's really just to give us the indication that climate change is affecting agricultural yield. Some analysis that was done that was looking at the impact of drought and severe weather conditions, and you can see this is just due to climate impacts, so not everything else is sort of being held steady. What might we expect to see in terms of food prices? And broadly across this is in Australia, and you can see that overall there was about a 33% increase in the price of vegetables and a 43% increase in fruit prices just due to the drought, in our extended drought. And of course you can see bananas, what happened to bananas with the cyclone. And we don't yet have the analysis that tells us what do people do, what do they replace their food intake with when things like that, who was affording the price of the bananas at the time. And then going the other way, of course, the whole food supply chain contributes to environmental degradation. As I said, it happens everywhere along the chain. It's partly to do with what goes in on the left-hand side and partly to do with what comes out on the right-hand side. I'm not going to read through that, but really we have this bi-directional relationship that we need to think about. And if we're thinking about climate adaptation, it is very, very difficult to stop adaptation without thinking about mitigation, certainly in the food system, because there is this ongoing circular relationship. And why is it a particular concern in cities? So I said in my opening remarks, of course, most of our population lives in cities now, so we've got more people need to be fed in cities. So a larger urban supply necessity. We have urban sprawl and issues of land development and what that is doing to local agricultural land, which if we if we do build over that food producing land, then we have to bring food into the cities from elsewhere. That makes sense. And what we do have is a dominance of the industrial food system, and we're going to unpick this in this session. So the idea of the large industrial supermarkets predominantly, which on one hand has brought us incredible availability of foods that we just never had before, so there are most certainly some real benefits to that. But what we also have on the more negative side is absolutely much greater availability of highly processed, ultra-processed foods that are junk in terms of nutrition. So if that's our dominance, and of course in the industrial system there is much greater use of some of the natural resources that we're concerned about. So it's sort of in that context for our project, Project 5 as it's called, trying to understand. So I've made comments about the industrial food subsystem, but we wanted to get a perspective across the range of food systems that are available to people within cities, what they can bring in terms of nutrition and health, and what they can do in terms of adapt to existing climate change and also prevent further harm. We had a large team of people involved in this, and as I say, you'll hear from Jane and Martin about specific parts of it. So these are the general questions that we were asking. So I'll talk about different food subsystems in a second. In a select region of Australia, we chose Greater Western Sydney, certainly one of our major food bowls in Australia, and to see how vulnerable are they in terms of climate change? How able are these different urban food subsystems to provide nutritious, affordable and culturally acceptable foods? And then doing that in a way that both helps cities both adapt and prevent further harm. So what do I mean when I say these food subsystems? We've broadly categorised them. There are a number of ways you can do this, but in essence this is what we observe in Australia. So you've got the industrial system. So in our instance, it's the Coles and the Woolworths, the big retail outlets. Then there are the alternative commercial food suppliers, and you'll hear from Martin a little bit more about them. And then of course there's civic production, so community gardens, backyard production of foods. So it's a combination, we get our food from a combination of these food subsystems. Now, I don't want you to dwell on that at all. There are many factors that contribute to what we put in our mouth. It's not just about the food system. We are predominantly going to speak about that in this session, but Jane will remind us that there's lots of things that happen in people's daily lives that also affect why people choose the foods that they choose. But we're trying to really understand these darker boxes. So in terms of climate exposures, how that relates to the urban food, the food subsystems that I've mentioned, what these food subsystems can do in terms of these indicators of food security, a very broad range of indicators, and then we'll do some reflection around the adaptation and mitigation strategies that might help us. But please don't forget that this happens in this much broader social context. So we had 4 or 5 domains of work. We're not going to speak about all of them today. Martin, so the first one was really what was out there in certainly in Greater Western Sydney, and particularly to do with the alternative commercial production and agriculture, urban agriculture. Then the second domain of work is the environmental footprint, which Martin will speak about, Martin Kirk. I'm going to tell you a bit more about the results that come out of domain 2, which was around if people wanted to eat in a healthy and sustainable way, theoretically, could they do it? And I'll speak about that. And then Jane will speak about domain 3, which was the sort of the socio-cultural aspects. Again, do people even care? Do people even want to eat in that way? And if they do, what are those other social issues that affect that? And then our last point, or the last domain of work, was trying to think about this all together. And I showed you the causal the complex system earlier on in the opening remarks. We've been doing the same with the food system. We've been having great fun with that. But so let me tell you just a little bit more about Domain 2. This was the one that I had most engagement with, and working closely with a number of colleagues you can see named here. So the idea of healthy and sustainable consumption and the issues of equity. So we wanted to see, could these different food subsystems in Greater Western Sydney provide a healthy and sustainable diet? And if they could it be done in an affordable, were they physically accessible, and were they affordable, the healthy and sustainable diet? So the challenge for what is a healthy and sustainable diet, and we've got a publication on this, a whole analysis around it, but there's 3 principles, and I'll let you look at them there. These are all primarily based on the National Dietary Guidelines. So first and foremost, the healthy and sustainable diet would meet the health guidelines, the dietary guidelines, and then we've replaced some of the foods in a typical diet to say what would be a more environmentally friendly food in that basket of foods. You are, of course, very welcome to have these slides. We will have all the slides available afterwards. So if people wanted to eat a healthy and sustainable diet, how much would that cost compared to a typical diet, what people are generally consuming? Across 5 different socioeconomic neighbourhoods, and the point of that that slide there is to say that in pretty much every neighbourhood, the healthy and sustainable diet would cost more than the typical diet. So an issue of cost and affordability. And in the lower socioeconomic neighbourhood, you would see it would cost 30% more. What does that mean? Well, you have to think about that in terms of affordability, because it's partly to do with price and it's partly to do with how much money people have available to them on a weekly basis. And again, we've broken it down by the different neighbourhoods, but really the point is to say that the lower, at the household level, spending the amount of money that it would cost for the healthy and sustainable diet relative to the median amount of money within these different income quintiles, the lowest socioeconomic income quintile would roughly have to spend about 45% of their weekly income to be able to purchase a healthy and sustainable diet. Once you start to get above 30% of your weekly income, things start to break down. You move into financial stress. So that if people wanted to eat healthily and sustainably, we've got a problem for the lower socioeconomic households. And in terms of, Annie mentioned earlier about you having access to a local grocery store, vitally, vitally important, but we've got to think what is in the local grocery store. The quality of produce affects what people purchase. Now, we can have a discussion about, do we need to have shiny, polished apples? That's a separate discussion. But the cost, just look at this top part. In the lower socioeconomic neighbourhood, you would pay $3.50 per kilo for that sort of apple, compared to in the highest socioeconomic neighbourhood, it's only $1 per kilogram. So in terms of what's available for people, if you were choosing a healthy and sustainable option, we've got to make sure that it is something that people would actually want to buy. So to wrap it up, what are some of the key action areas? I haven't shown you the analysis that was the physical access to the different food subsystems. And what we did find with that analysis was that none of them are walkable. So what do? One, we need to think about subsidies to make sure that sustainable food options are not costing more. So in terms of supporting the producers. The real cost of healthy and sustainable living, well, let's reflect that in welfare rates, for example, if that's an argument that we want to pursue. Sustainable land use and tax incentives, let's bring the alternative commercial producers into the lower socioeconomic neighbourhoods. And then thinking about transport, the sorts of issues that Annie was talking about earlier this morning. That's all about issues of governance, and I think we'll pick up on this as we go out throughout the course of the day. Issues of governance. We can do these sorts of things, but we need a national food policy and nutrition policy that recognises these sorts of issues. And that's the take-home message from the food project broadly, not just from Domain 2. But if we do want to be able to be resilient to climate shocks that we're increasingly seeing, the idea of diversity of supply chains is not just one or the other, the idea of different business models and a diversity of land use.